Andrei Chikatilo, also known as the Rostov Ripper, is one of the most notorious serial killers in the history of the Soviet Union. Between 1978 and 1990, he committed several brutal crimes, killing at least 52 people, mostly women and children. His case has become one of the most studied and shocking in the history of forensic science, not only because of the scale of the brutality, but also because of the complex and lengthy investigation that eventually led to his capture. I killed to feel alive. Every time I remember their faces, these words of Andrei Chikatilo, one of the most horrific serial killers in history, make one shudder with horror. It is not only the fact of the murders that frightens mankind, but also how a monster can grow out of an ordinary person. Let's delve into his dark past and examine his crimes, victims, and the aftermath that will linger with us for a long time to come. Childhood and Holodomor, Andrei Chikatilo was born on 16 October 1936 in the Ukrainian village of Yabloknoye. The family lived in poverty and his parents worked on a collective farm. He claimed that in 1933 his older brother Stepan was eaten by cannibals during the Holodomor. The story is dubious. Perhaps his mother told it to frighten her son. In 1941, his father went to the front, and the occupation brought even more suffering. Chikatilo recalled how he hid from bombings, starved, saw his house burning. These events left a deep mark on his psyche. He preferred literature and radio to dating. At the age of 18, Chikatilo went to build power lines on a Komsomol ticket. His attempts at intimacy with girls failed because of erectile problems. Failures plunged him into depression. Suicidal thoughts appeared. Salvation was the study. He enrolled in the correspondence department of the Moscow Electromechanical Institute. However, 2 years later, he was drafted into the army. He served first in the KGB border troops in Central Asia, then serviced communication lines in Berlin. Fellow soldiers mocked his female waist and breasts. According to Chikatilo, he was subjected to forced homosexual contact in the army. When fellow servicemen offered to introduce me to some woman, I refused, preferring to read socio-political literature and listen to the radio, he said. After demobilization, he returned to his native village, where he began an affair with a neighbor, Tanya Narozhnaya, a good girl, modest. We've been friends for 3 months. We've already agreed to get married. Chikatilo proudly recalled himself of those years. Young, handsome, tall, slender, KGB epaulets. I had already joined the party. My mood was buoyant. Everything failed, Chikatilo confessed. Intimate intimacy with his fiancée failed, and the girl spread this information among the villagers. Unable to bear the shame, Andrei fled the village. Life got better. His own flat, a job. Career growth did not fill the void in his personal life. Sister Tanya undertook to arrange the fate of his brother and introduced him to a modest, hard-working girl from a large family. In 1963, when Andrei was 27 years old, they got married. Before the wedding, there were no intimate relations between us, recalled Theodosia, whom her husband affectionately called Fenichka or Fialochka. From the very first wedding night, I felt his sexual weakness. This condition lasted for 15 to 20 years of our life together. He had intercourse no more than once every 2 or 3 months. A few years after his marriage, Chikatilo entered the philological faculty of Rostov State University. He studied by correspondence, combining work and family life. In 1965, a daughter, Lyudmila, was born. In 1969, a son, Yuri. In 1970, at the age of 34, Andrei received a university diploma, which opened the way to teaching. Chikatilo starts working with children. In 1970, he got a job as a teacher of Russian language and literature at a boarding school in Novoshakhtinsk. Everything seemed to be going well, but the 34-year-old teacher began to show strange behavior. He began to harass female pupils. Pretending to be a caring teacher, Chikatilo would sit down with schoolgirls, ostensibly to explain difficult moments in their studies, and he himself would start touching the girls. And sometimes Andrei waited until the students began to prepare for bed and undress, and then suddenly entered their bedroom. Soon the talk about inappropriate behavior of the teacher reached the management of the boarding school, and Chikatilo himself gave a reason for dismissal. On one of the warm days, he took his charges swimming at a local reservoir. At one point, Andrei noticed that one of the senior school girls swam far away. Feigning concern for the girl's life, the teacher swam up to her and began to harass her. The schoolgirl began to fight back, and Chikatilo suddenly realized that he was aroused by the screams and resistance of the teenager. Deviations in his behavior became more and more noticeable. Unashamedly, he stuck his hands in his trouser pockets and touched his genitals in front of the students. They, in turn, taunted the teacher and teased him directly to his face as a pervert and onanist. It all ended with the fact that one day Chikatilo put his hand in the pants of his 15-year-old pupil. The teenager raised a ruckus, to which his peers fled. They mobbed the pedophile and beat him up. But this prank cost him his job. Chikatilo was forced to write a letter of resignation. First blood. In 1978, Chikatilo committed his first murder. Having moved to Shakti, he secretly saved up 1,500 rubles and bought a house, which became a den for his dark desires. On 22nd December, he lured an 8-year-old girl there on the promise of imported gum. As soon as the trusting child crossed the threshold, the maniac pounced on the victim. The girl's screams and resistance only fueled his animal passion. After the rape, he stabbed her several times in the stomach, strangled her, abused her body, and threw it into the Grushevka River. After the discovery of the body, investigators interviewed local residents. Some saw the deceased with a suspicious man. A sketch was drawn up in which the director of the GPTU identified his employee Chikatilo. Andrei's wife was silent about her husband's oddities, his sudden disappearances, inadequate behavior. Moreover, Feodosia gave him a false alibi, saying that on the day of the murder, Chikatilo did not leave the house. In a hurry to report on solving the crime before the new year, the police detained Alexander Kravchenko, previously convicted for the murder of a girl. Although Kravchenko's wife insisted on his innocence, after his arrest for stealing from a neighbor, the operatives put a drug addict in his cell who beat the suspect, demanding a confession to the murder. Unable to withstand the torture, Kravchenko signed a confession. At the same time, the police intimidated his wife, threatening to accuse her of complicity if she did not recant her confession. Kravchenko was sentenced to 15 years, and later, under pressure from the victim's relatives, the case was reviewed and the death sentence was handed down. The real killer, Chikatilo, was forgotten for years. This was only the beginning of his bloody path. Madness takes shape. After his first murder, Chikatilo went into hiding, fearing exposure. But the fear receded a few months later when he murdered a 17-year-old vocational school student. The girl, who worked as a prostitute, agreed to go with him to the deserted banks of the Don. And he also says, "Machine, you do not work," and starts laughing. Of course, it pissed me off because I was embarrassed, started to diffuse the psyche, cut everything without looking, recalled the maniac about his reaction to the taunts of the victim after his sexual failure. The girl's death was agonizing. He bit off her nipples and stuffed her mouth with dirt until she suffocated. Although Chikatilo himself confessed to the crime, it remained unproven, as did the first murder. What was proven was his involvement in the murder of a 13-year-old schoolgirl in June 1982. In the same year, he took the lives of 6 other children from 9 to 16 years old. Chikatilo sought out his victims at railway stations, bus stops, and electric trains, looking for children without parents. After gaining their trust, the maniac took them away, promising them entertainment or treats. Sometimes children followed their executioner for kilometers. The atrocities he committed shocked even experienced investigators. Dismemberment alive, cutting out organs, torture. At first, the detectives assumed that the perpetrator was a morgue employee. For Chikatilo, the sex of the victims did not matter. What mattered was their helplessness, which gave him a sense of power. Although the victims were predominantly teenagers with straight blonde hair. In his sadism, he used the knife as a dildo. Especially the maniac was occupied with gouging out the eyes, according to one version, for fear of imprinting on the retina, according to another, because of shame in front of the victims. Parts of the bodies of the murdered Chikatilo sometimes took with him. The wife recalled the strange habit of her husband to take on business trips, a small pot. He himself admitted that he ate the genitals of the victims, believing that it would improve potency. The maniac cut up the clothes of the murdered and scattered them, and washed his own blood-stained clothes in public toilets. Later, he told that he was caught doing this by the police, but they showed no interest. When investigators examined the tortured bodies of the victims, they refused to believe that a sane person could have done such a thing. The final hunt. The capture of Chikatilo was complicated by the lack of living witnesses. No one could identify the killer. Fingerprints at the crime scenes proved unsuitable for identification. Finding no solid evidence, the detectives were forced to let the maniac go after each arrest. One day, Chikatilo's blood was taken for analysis. The sample showed the second group, while the semen found on one of the victims belonged to the fourth group. He was released again. After the final arrest of the maniac, there were theories about a rare feature of his organism. Allegedly, blood and excretions had different groups. The sensation was not confirmed. The error occurred due to contaminated preparations when analyzing semen. The last victim was a 22-year-old prostitute. Returning from the scene of the crime, Chikatilo encountered a policeman who checked his documents. Although the patrolman did not detain the suspicious man, he mentioned him in his report. When the body of the murdered woman was found, investigators came across a familiar surname. The arrest took place on the evening of the 20th of November, 1990. Before that, the maniac visited the hospital. His penultimate victim, a 16-year-old boy, managed to bite and break his finger in a desperate struggle for life. After the hospital, Chikatilo went for a beer, and on the way tried to get acquainted with underage boys. Operatives who had been tracking the killer immediately apprehended him, interrupting a chain of murders that lasted 12 years. Final beast. A search of Chikatilo's house revealed a whole arsenal: 23 kitchen knives, a hammer for killing victims, shoes with footprints that matched the prints at the crime scenes, and a briefcase with a maniac's kit, rope, knife, and Vaseline. But all this remained only circumstantial evidence. The arrested man stubbornly denied his guilt. The investigators brought in psychiatrists. It turned out that Chikatilo sincerely considered himself unique and misunderstood. When the doctor began to describe his inner feelings, the maniac burst into tears and began to confess. According to another version, he was promised treatment instead of punishment if he told the doctor everything. Of the 55 murders to which Chikatilo confessed, the court recognized 52 as proven. 3 times a forensic psychiatric examination was conducted, each time confirming his sanity. This did not prevent the killer from feigning insanity and denying his confessions. At the court hearings, Chikatilo was first placed in a large iron cage. The authorities feared lynching by the relatives of the victims. Their fears were not in vain. During the hearing, the maniac shouted insults, exposed genitals, claimed to be pregnant and nursing. Witnesses recalled how the word firing squad in the verdict caused applause in the hall. However, Chikatilo himself hoped to avoid execution. He made complaints to the authorities and newspapers, justifying himself by saying that he had worked for 40 years for the good of the country, lived a hard-working life under communist tyranny. On February 14, 1994, he was executed with a shot to the back of the head. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in the cemetery of Novocherkassk prison. All members of the maniac's family changed their names and moved away. They strove to forget the terrible relative, all except the son Yuri, who after the army engaged in racketeering and robbery, having served a total of about 12 years. For some time he willingly gave interviews, justifying his father and claiming that he was simply hung unsolved murders. Remember the maniac and filmmakers. He became the hero of dozens of documentaries. In the feature film, his image embodied the brilliant Malcolm McDowell, which can be considered a great and undeserved compliment. Bonus are several TV series, more than a dozen songs and books. People love anything unusual, and a real non-movie killer is much more interesting. Except that thanks to all this hype, Chikatilo has some followers.